January morning, frost on the ground. Through the smoke of battle, German soldiers whisper one name again and again, 50 caliber. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't beautiful, but wherever it spoke, men disappeared. They first heard it above Stuttgart, a deep, rhythmic thunder rolling through the sky. It wasn't artillery, it wasn't bombs. It was the sound of a weapon that never stopped. It wasn't born from genius. It came from factories, from steel, from hands that never stopped working. Each gun identical, each one unbreakable. The Germans built art, the Americans built quantity. If you enjoy uncovering hidden truths of World War II, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this, because what follows isn't just about one gun. It's about an empire of fire that changed the war forever. January 26, 1945. Holtzwihr, France. Snow lay heavy on the fields. The air was still, except for the distant crack of rifles. A German soldier from the 2nd Mountain Division stared through a shattered window, watching medics carry the wounded across the frozen street. They had attacked with 250 men and 6 tanks against a single American officer standing on a burning tank destroyer. That man had one weapon, a 50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun, and within 1 hour, the German force was nearly erased. It wasn't a secret invention, nor a masterpiece of engineering. It was old, built in 1933, made from steel and certainty. Each part had been copied 1,000 times, each gun identical, and yet its presence turned battles into massacres. That morning, amid the snow and smoke, German soldiers saw something they had never believed possible. One weapon, so simple that it changed the rhythm of fear itself. Audie Murphy was barely 20 years old, cold, bleeding, half-deaf from the thunder of battle. He climbed atop a burning M10 tank destroyer and gripped the Browning 50 caliber machine gun mounted on its turret. Below him, a German company advanced across the open field, armored vehicles and infantry together. For one endless hour, Murphy fought alone. Every burst of fire carved through metal and bone alike, until the German line disintegrated into silence. When it was over, only 70 soldiers remained able to fight. The snow, once white, had turned to ash and blood. Murphy collapsed beside the smoking gun, too exhausted to lift it again. But the weapon had done what no man could. It never stopped. It jammed for no one, froze for no one, and demanded only ammunition. In its rhythm, the Germans heard the heartbeat of industrial war, steady, cold, and merciless. In nearby aid stations, German medics began to understand a new kind of wound. Limbs shattered beyond repair, torsos torn apart by force alone. Unlike rifle bullets, the 50 caliber did not pierce. It crushed, it ripped, it erased. The survivors trembled, not from pain, but from disbelief. How could one bullet carry the strength to end life so completely and keep firing without rest? Doctors whispered of hopelessness. They had no tools for such destruction. They could only give morphine, bandage what remained, and wait for silence. For every soldier brought in, 10 more never arrived, and those who lived could still hear it, that deep, heavy rhythm that turned courage into hesitation. In time, the medics began to say that the most terrible sound of all was not the gunfire, but the moment it stopped. As night fell, the snow began to glow from distant fires. German soldiers sat in silence inside ruined houses, their faces pale and distant. They spoke softly about the American weapon, the one that roared like thunder and never seemed to stop. Even those who had never seen it began to imagine it, the rhythm, the smoke, the endless flashes of light. Fear was spreading faster than the cold. Across the front lines, entire units refused to move during daylight. The moment they heard that slow, heavy sound, they froze. It wasn't just the destruction it caused, but the helplessness it carried. Cover meant nothing. Walls broke apart. Trees shattered into splinters. The .50 caliber Browning had become more than a machine. It was an idea that no one could hide from American fire. And once that belief took hold, the battle was already lost. When morning came, the forest was quiet again. Frost covered the burned vehicles. Smoke drifted over the frozen fields. German medics still moved among the fallen, their boots sinking into soft ash. No one spoke. Somewhere in the distance, a single .50 caliber gun still echoed. Slow, deliberate, unstoppable. For the German commanders, the meaning was clear. They had faced courage before. They understood bravery. But this was something else. This was the sound of industry made into a weapon, of factories speaking through steel. The lesson of Holtzwihr was not about one man, but about the machine that never slept. And soon, the skies above Stuttgart would carry that same thunder, multiplied 1,000 times. It was September 6th, 1943, over Stuttgart. Hundreds of American bombers appeared through thin clouds, glinting like silver ghosts. The German air defenses had seen raids before, but not like this. The sky filled with aircraft, B-17 flying fortresses, each one bristling with guns. German pilots of the Luftwaffe climbed to intercept, confident in their Focke-Wulf fighters and their skill. They expected another easy victory, another burning trail of smoke behind a bomber. But as they approached, something strange happened. The bombers did not scatter. They erupted with fire. From every direction came the same rhythm, the same deep roar of .50 caliber guns. The air between them turned to steel. At 800 meters, the fighters began to shake. Their wings rattled with impacts, and men who had laughed moments before were now screaming through the radio. The first raid on Stuttgart became a revelation that courage meant nothing against mathematics. Each flying fortress carried 13 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, manned by 10 men who had trained to fire as one. 36 bombers in a formation meant more than 400 heavy guns, firing thousands of rounds each minute. In the air, this became something new, a moving fortress made of light and thunder. German fighters flew into it and vanished. Some exploded mid-air. Others simply fell apart, engines trailing smoke into the clouds. Pilots who survived told the same story. The tracers filled the sky like red rain. The air shimmered with heat and metal. At that moment, the German flyers realized the Americans had created not a formation, but a wall that killed anything that tried to pass. They called it Der Stahlregen, the rain of steel. And, for the first time, the hunters of the Reich became the hunted. The Luftwaffe pilots were trained to aim for precision, short bursts, careful approach, the art of patience. But against the 50 caliber guns, patience meant death. A single bomber formation could fire 6,000 rounds each minute, and every bullet carried enough energy to pierce armor, concrete, and flesh. At that range, skill was meaningless. Only chance decided who lived. When they landed, the surviving pilots wrote brief reports and long silences. They had seen aircraft torn apart not by explosives, but by endless consistency, by the gun that never jammed. One pilot said it best. You could not dodge it. You could only fly into it, and hope the sky forgave you. From that day, the sound of the 50 caliber became more than a weapon. It became a memory that haunted the airmen long after they left the cockpit. Inside each flying fortress, men worked like parts of a machine. 10 crewmen breathing in rhythm, shouting over the noise, feeding ammunition belts that glowed red from heat. The tail gunner watched tracers curl across the sky. The top turret spun endlessly, and the ball gunner fired from his glass cage beneath the belly of the plane. They called it teamwork, but to the Germans below, it looked like a single creature made of fire. Every bomber carried thousands of rounds, enough for hours of defense. Even when engines were hit, the guns kept shooting. Even when flames burst from fuel tanks, the tracers still arced into the air. The weapon didn't care if its host was dying. It just spoke louder, faster, until nothing dared to fly near. In the roar of the 50 caliber, men could hear the soul of the American war machine, cold, methodical, unstoppable. By late autumn of 1943, the German High Command understood. They weren't fighting men anymore. They were fighting production. Each flying fortress carried more firepower than an entire platoon. Each formation was a moving factory of death. The Luftwaffe still sent pilots to fight, but many never returned. Those who did spoke in half sentences, hands trembling as they removed their gloves. The Americans had found the formula that no strategy could match: volume over precision, reliability over brilliance. And as the sky turned red over Stuttgart, a new chapter of the war began. From that moment on, fear would no longer live only in the air. Soon, it would crawl across the ground, carried on trucks, jeeps, and tanks, all armed with the same unyielding gun. The thunder above had become the drumbeat of something larger, a doctrine born from industry itself. German pilots once believed they ruled the sky. They trusted in their Focke-Wulf fighters, in the sharp bite of their 20mm cannons, in their discipline and training. But when they attacked the American bombers, all that certainty fell apart. The air filled with glowing lines, 1 in 5 bullets marked by a tracer. For every streak of light they saw, 4 invisible bullets followed behind. Those who survived described the feeling as flying into a storm made of fire. Engines screamed, canopies shattered, and the world became a blur of heat and metal. There was no way through it. Even skill became meaningless. You could not dodge a wall of steel. You could only hope to escape before it found you. And for the first time, the Luftwaffe began to whisper that courage had limits. The German reports told the same story. Each time a formation appeared, hundreds of machine guns opened fire. Each gun could release up to 10 rounds each second, and the bombers flew in tight boxes, covering every angle with crossfire. In theory, it was impossible. In practice, it worked perfectly. Even when one bomber was hit, another filled its place. The formation was alive, breathing, adjusting, correcting. The Luftwaffe tried every tactic: head-on dives, attacks from below, even vertical climbs through blind spots. But nothing worked. Every approach met the same outcome: walls of fire, broken wings, and silence. One German ace wrote to his family, "To attack the Americans is to fly through a storm of steel." That sentence would echo in training halls for the rest of the war. A quiet admission that even experience could not save them. A German pilot named Wolfgang Fischer later said in his debriefing, "It was like flying into a meat grinder." He described bombers that burned, yet still fired. Engines dying, gunners screaming, but the machine guns never stopped. The Browning .50 caliber didn't need perfection. It only needed to exist. Every bullet found a reason. Every burst erased another name. The Germans realized they were not facing men anymore, but a system. One that valued reliability over elegance, volume over precision. And that system was winning. If you enjoy hearing stories of forgotten battles and the machines that shaped them, tap like. It helps this history reach more people. Because soon the thunder of those guns would move from the sky to the ground, and the storm of steel would follow wherever the Americans went. German pilots soon learned that the Browning .50 caliber was not the strongest weapon in the war, but it was the most relentless. Their own cannons jammed at high altitude. Their machine guns froze in the cold air. The American weapon didn't care. It kept firing through snow, through heat, through flames. Even when struck by shrapnel, the gunners reloaded, and the barrels glowed red until they nearly melted. To the Germans, this was unnatural. A weapon should break, should fail, should surrender to the elements. But the Browning refused. It was more than a machine. It was a rhythm. Every plane, every convoy, every tank shared that same pulse, the same sound. It was as if the Americans had built a single heartbeat, multiplied across the world. And every time it echoed, the Reich lost another piece of the sky. When the last bomber vanished beyond the clouds, the battlefield was quiet. Smoke hung low over Stuttgart. Pieces of aluminum drifted like falling snow. German crews walked among the wreckage, their boots crunching on shattered glass. They had survived, but their certainty had not. For years they had trusted skill, precision, and design. Now they had seen something different: the victory of mass over mastery. The lesson sank deep. The Americans had discovered that war was not about elegance. It was about endurance. The Browning was not just a gun. It was the symbol of a nation that refused to stop. And as those pilots wrote their reports, the same thunder was already being heard far below, in the hedgerows of Normandy, where tanks and trucks now carried that same unending sound. The storm that ruled the skies was coming to Earth. June 6th, 1944. The beaches of Normandy trembled beneath the sound of engines and surf. German defenders waited behind bunkers, ready for the invasion they had feared for years. But what came ashore was not just men. It was the same thunder that once ruled the skies. Mounted on jeeps, trucks, and tanks, the Browning .50 caliber had arrived. The gun that once guarded bombers now roared across the beaches. It tore through machine gun nests, fences, and stone walls alike. Every vehicle carried one, sometimes two. The air was thick with sand and lead. To the Germans, it felt as if the sea itself had opened fire. And, as smoke rose over the coast, one truth became clear. The weapon that had conquered the air was now claiming the earth. Colonel Hans von Luck, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, watched the horizon burn. He had fought in North Africa and earned the Knight's Cross. He believed he had seen everything war could offer. But Normandy was different. Everywhere his troops moved, the same sound followed, the heavy rhythm of the .50 caliber. It came from every vehicle, every hill, every convoy. His men could not lift their heads without drawing fire. Von Luck later wrote, "We could not move in daylight. The Americans had enough ammunition to make mistakes and still win." That sentence became his quiet confession, that courage alone meant nothing. The Americans had turned logistics into a weapon. Every truck, every tank destroyer, every jeep was part of a single voice, a voice that spoke only through steel and smoke. And for the first time, even a seasoned panzer commander felt small before something he could not outthink. The German army had always built its doctrine around the machine gun, the MG-34, and later the MG-42. Fast, precise, deadly. But the Americans had taken that idea and multiplied it beyond imagination. A single armored division carried hundreds of .50 caliber guns, each one mounted, manned, and fed by endless belts of ammunition. They created overlapping fields of fire that erased the meaning of cover. German soldiers described the sound as something alive. It didn't roar. It pulsed. A deep, rolling beat that moved through forests and villages, echoing from stone and soil. Every burst was a reminder that the Americans fought with factories behind them. The MG-42 might sing with speed, but the .50 caliber spoke with certainty. And on that day in Normandy, certainty was deadlier than skill. The Americans advanced differently. They did not wait for ambushes. They created them. Convoys rolled forward through the hedgerows, guns already roaring into the tree lines. Every shadow, every barn, every stone wall was treated as a threat. They called it reconnaissance by fire, discovering the enemy by forcing him to reveal himself. To the Germans, it felt like madness. They watched bullets tear through empty houses, saw trees explode for no reason. Yet somewhere inside that chaos, their positions were always found. The .50 caliber machine guns didn't just protect, they hunted. Each vehicle fired in a rhythm that overlapped with the next, covering both sides of the road. The air itself became a weapon, filled with dust, noise, and flying metal. Even when no one was there, the Americans fired, because silence, to them, was dangerous. In the weeks after the landings, German ambush teams tried again and again to stop the American convoys. They hid behind walls, waited for the lead truck to pass, then opened fire. But the return fire came faster, louder, and from every direction at once. The convoy was no line of targets. It was a living fortress that answered with hundreds of voices, all speaking the same language of steel. Those who survived the ambushes spoke of terror unlike the front. The Americans did not pause. they turned, advanced, and kept shooting. Vehicles on the right side fired right. Vehicles on the left fired left. Each burst intersected in the middle, covering the fields in glowing arcs. To move was to die. By the end of that summer, the Germans no longer tried to stop the roads. They had learned what their commanders refused to admit, that logistics itself had become a weapon. And soon, the roads would not be the only places where fire ruled. The same thunder would fall again, this time from the skies. By the late summer of 1944, the Americans had turned every road in France into a moving artery of war. Trucks rumbled day and night, carrying fuel, ammunition, and men toward the front. Each vehicle bore the same armor of confidence, a Browning .50 caliber heavy machine gun mounted high above the cab. It watched the horizon like a guardian, never resting, never silent. German commanders soon realized that ambushing these convoys was impossible. Even a handful of vehicles could unleash a storm of return fire that shredded the countryside. One officer later said, "They moved like rivers of steel. You could strike the banks, but never stop the flow." Every bullet fired by those guns was a note in a much larger symphony, the sound of a nation supplying itself faster than its enemies could destroy it. The front line was no longer a place, it was a process. For the Germans, war had always been measured in tactics, in maneuvers, flanks, and precision. For the Americans, it was measured in numbers. One gun was good, 1,000 were better. Every convoy carried spare barrels, endless ammunition, and mechanics who could rebuild a weapon in minutes. The Browning machine gun was not just a tool, it was a constant. Wherever the Americans went, it was already waiting. Even air raids or fuel shortages could not slow them down. Factories back home replaced everything faster than the Germans could destroy it. Every truck destroyed was rebuilt. Every bullet spent was replaced by 10 more. The Germans began to say that America was not a country. It was a machine that made machines. And as the sound of engines filled every valley and road, they started to understand that they were no longer fighting soldiers. They were fighting production itself. The true battle was not on the maps. It was in the constant hum of engines, in the clatter of belts feeding through steel guns. The Americans fought a war of distance, a war where every mile conquered was already supplied. Their convoys connected oceans to fields, ports to foxholes. Even the smallest outpost had more ammunition than entire German battalions. German soldiers began to feel the difference long before seeing the enemy. They could hear it, the endless mechanical chorus moving through the night. The sound of tires on dirt, of metal tapping metal, of weapons ready before dawn. The front was no longer where men met each other. It was where the noise stopped. And in that silence, the Germans knew they were alone. Logistics had become the shadow army, unseen, unstoppable, and always arriving on time. In the beginning, the Germans mocked the American way of war. They saw soldiers firing into empty fields, wasting bullets, wasting time. But the more they fought, the more that laughter faded. Those endless bullets, those reckless bursts of fire, they were not waste, they were insurance. The Americans had more ammunition than fear. A German officer later admitted, they could afford to fight wrong and still win. That sentence summed up the new kind of warfare. It wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. Every American convoy carried more shells than an entire German regiment. Every machine gun had replacement parts ready before the barrel even overheated. It was a system built to never pause. And when the Germans looked across the fields of France, they understood. The war was no longer about courage or invention. It was about who could keep shooting longest. By autumn of 1944, the Germans stopped calling the Americans an army. They began calling them the machine. Every time the roads thundered with convoys, every time the .50 caliber roared across the valleys, it reminded them that the war had shifted beyond their reach. The Americans didn't fight for ground. They fought for momentum, and momentum never slept. The skies soon joined that rhythm. Thunderbolts flew low over the countryside, carrying the same weapon, the same sound, the same purpose, to never stop firing. From that point on, the Germans were trapped between earth and air, between the fire they could see and the fire that hunted them from above. The Browning .50 caliber had become the heartbeat of an entire war. And soon, that heartbeat would echo through the clouds once more. The first warning was never the sight. It was the sound. A low hum that deepened into a growl, then into a roar that filled the sky. By the time the German soldiers looked up, the planes were already above them. American thunderbolts swept over the countryside, sunlight flashing on their metal wings like knives of light. Each carried 8 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine guns. 8 voices that spoke the same merciless language. They flew low, close to the ground, engines screaming as they unleashed lines of glowing fire across fields and roads. Trucks burst into flames, men scattered for cover, and even tanks trembled under the weight of impact. It was not chaos. It was precision shaped by abundance. Each thunderbolt carried enough ammunition to destroy an entire column, and there were always more waiting behind. To the soldiers below, the sky had changed its nature. It no longer belonged to gods or weather. It belonged to the machine that never slept. When 4 thunderbolts flew together, 32 heavy guns spoke in one rhythm. Each second poured hundreds of bullets into the earth below, a storm of lead that erased anything it touched. German convoys vanished beneath it. Engines melted, fuel tanks ignited, and soldiers threw themselves into ditches that offered no safety. Even stone walls could not stand against that much force. The air shimmered from the heat of friction alone. One survivor later wrote, "You hear the planes first, then the world disappears." The attacks came like seasons, sudden, unstoppable, and always returning. Sometimes the sky was silent for hours, only to erupt again without warning. What frightened soldiers most was not the destruction, but the rhythm. Each wave of aircraft sounded exactly like the one before. They realized the Americans did not improvise. They produced. And that kind of consistency felt inhuman. It was not hate, it was process. By the autumn of 1944, every German soldier could recognize the sound. The deep hum, the high-pitched whistle of diving engines, the rhythmic percussion of the Browning .50 caliber guns. They did not look up anymore. They simply ran. Every open road was a trap, every field a target. Even forests no longer offered comfort, for the bullets cut through branches like dry straw. There was no defense against the sky. The Americans called it armed reconnaissance, searching for targets while patrolling, but for the Germans below, it was judgment from above. The sky itself had turned hostile. The thunderbolts appeared, struck, and vanished, leaving only silence and smoke. One soldier wrote, "You can survive artillery, but not the sky." That feeling haunted them long after the battle. If you enjoy learning about the machines that reshaped the Second World War, leave a comment below. Which weapon do you think truly defined modern warfare? Because from this point onward, the war would never again return to silence. By winter, the German army had learned to move only at night. Daylight meant death. They covered their trucks with branches, painted the roofs of tanks to match the mud, and prayed for clouds. But the Americans had patience. They waited above, invisible behind the mist, listening for movement, watching for light. And when the weather cleared, the sky came alive again. The thunderbolts appeared in pairs, sometimes in groups of 4, sweeping over roads and forests, searching for anything that moved. Their pilots knew the land better than those who fought on it. They attacked bridges, trains, convoys, even single motorcycles, anything that hinted at life. The soldiers below learned a terrible new instinct: stillness. To move was to die. To survive was to freeze and hope the clouds returned. And when the engines faded into the distance, they knew they had only borrowed time until the next patrol circled back. As the months passed, the Germans stopped thinking of the Thunderbolt as a plane. They called it the Hunter. It did not fly missions. It prowled. It watched roads, waited for smoke, and struck without mercy. Every bullet it fired came from the same heart that powered the American war machine, the Browning .50 caliber. The sound was constant, calm, inevitable, like the ticking of a clock counting down the end of their world. Even when the planes were gone, soldiers still felt them above. Their shadows seemed to stretch across every field. Some began to dream of the noise, waking to silence that felt wrong. The fear no longer lived in the sky. It lived inside them. When spring came and the Americans pushed toward the German border, the lesson was already written in smoke. No wall, no forest, no armor could stop the rhythm of fire. And soon, that rhythm would echo through cities made of stone. When the Americans entered the towns of France, they brought the battlefield with them. Narrow streets, stone houses, and high windows became traps for both sides. The German defenders were skilled. They knew every corner, every line of sight. But the Americans had something the cities had never seen before: the Browning .50 caliber machine gun. Mounted on tanks, jeeps, and half-tracks, it turned every street into a firing range. Each burst shattered windows and walls, sending clouds of dust and brick into the air. The bullets tore through doors, furniture, and men hiding behind stone. Nothing stopped them. Even the thick masonry of European buildings could not hold back that kind of force. The weapon had been designed for the open sky. Yet, in the narrow echo of a city, its power multiplied. The noise filled every alley like thunder trapped in a box. And with every echo, another corner fell silent. German soldiers used to believe in walls. They trusted stone, concrete, and shadow. But when the Americans advanced, the walls became illusions. The .50 caliber rounds punched through 3, sometimes 4 rooms in a single burst. Furniture splintered, ceilings collapsed, and soldiers died without ever seeing who fired. The power of the weapon wasn't just its size, it was its certainty. Tanks would halt at an intersection, and their commanders would sweep the buildings ahead with long bursts of fire. Glass shattered, plaster rained down, and hidden snipers were forced to the ground. The city became a living echo chamber of destruction. What once felt safe now betrayed them. For the first time, German infantry learned that there was no difference between cover and concealment. The bullets didn't just break walls, they broke faith in protection itself. The city had turned against those who defended it. The Americans fought methodically. A tank would stop at a crossroads. Its commander would rise from the hatch, and the .50 caliber would begin its song. The rounds swept across the facades like a broom of light and dust. When the echoes faded, infantry moved forward, step by step, through a silence filled with floating debris. It wasn't courage that drove them, it was coordination. Each gunner trusted the rhythm, the sequence, the pattern of destruction that cleared their path. To the Germans trapped inside those buildings, it sounded like a storm rolling across the rooftops. They could feel the impact in the floors beneath their boots. Every burst reminded them that they were being erased from the map, one wall at a time. No order, no strategy, no prayer could stop it. The Americans had found a way to turn sound itself into a weapon, and every city that heard it eventually fell quiet. In the ruins of French towns, war began to sound different. Not like shouting or running or fear, but like breathing. The air itself pulsed with every burst from the .50 caliber guns. Windows shattered one after another, walls trembled, and thick dust filled the light like mist. German defenders clung to upper floors, waiting for the next volley, knowing that the next bullet could pass through stone as easily as paper. The streets below were alive with motion. American tanks crept forward, their commanders standing tall behind the guns, scanning rooftops through drifting smoke. Each time they fired, the sound echoed like thunder through empty churches and broken markets. In that rhythm, the city seemed to inhale and exhale, a living body tearing itself apart. For the men inside those buildings, the noise was worse than the danger, because it never stopped. Even when the shooting paused, they could hear the barrels cooling, ticking like a clock counting down to silence. By nightfall, the towns were no longer made of stone. They were made of dust. It clung to uniforms, to hands, to memories. Every house was hollow, every street lined with rubble. The Americans advanced not through victory, but through erosion. Each burst of the .50 caliber stripped away another layer of the city's past. Shops, schools, cathedrals, all reduced to shapes and shadows. The German soldiers who survived those battles wrote afterward that silence became unbearable. They missed the sound of gunfire, because it meant they were still alive. Without it, the world felt too quiet, too fragile, like a breath about to end. And when darkness finally came, another terror began. The tracers that once lit the skies over Stuttgart now returned, glowing lines of light that painted the night. The fire that once fell from the heavens would soon fill the streets again. But this time, it would burn in colors the soldiers would never forget. Night should have been a refuge. For centuries, soldiers had trusted the dark. It hid them, protected them, gave them time to breathe. But in the last years of the war, even darkness betrayed them. When the Americans opened fire, the night itself began to glow. Lines of red and white light arced across the fields, slow enough to see, but too fast to escape. The Browning .50 caliber had turned the black sky into a burning map. German soldiers watched in silence as the tracers weaved through the air. Each fifth round carried light, a marker meant for aim. But for those on the ground, it felt like watching death draw its own path. Every flash left a trail that lingered in their eyes long after it vanished. They learned not to look, but instinct always forced them to. Even when safe, even in dreams, they saw those lines again, crossing the dark like falling stars that never wished for mercy. At night, the battlefield became something unreal. Tracers drifted through the smoke like spirits, bright enough to cast moving shadows across the snow. Each burst from the .50 caliber machine guns sent rivers of light flowing above the fields. To the Germans, it felt like the sky had caught fire. Every fifth bullet carried a glowing heart that burned through the mist. And behind it, 4 invisible bullets followed close behind. The soldiers called it ghost fire. They said you could watch it travel, but never avoid it. By the time the light reached you, the rest had already arrived. One officer later wrote, "We feared the dark, not because we could not see, but because they could." The night was no longer a place of safety. It was a stage, lit by American fire, written in streaks of red and gold, where silence was broken only by the whisper of endless thunder. In the final winter of the war, the nights were brighter than the days. Flares hung above the forests, fires burned inside ruined homes, and the tracers of the .50 caliber stitched glowing patterns through the cold air. German soldiers huddled in trenches, their faces pale in the red light. They said it looked like the sky itself was bleeding, but to the Americans it was routine, a rhythm they followed without thought, a pulse that beat faster than fear. The battlefield was no longer about who saw first, but who never stopped seeing. Every burst revealed the next target. Every glow erased another shadow. The light ruled the dark, and as the Germans stared upward, they realized they were fighting an army that had made even the night its ally. If you're fascinated by these haunting moments of history, share this story with someone who believes war is silence. Because once you've seen a night like this, you never forget the color of fear. In the still hours before dawn, the battlefield glowed like an open wound. Streams of tracer light drifted slowly through the mist, fading, then blooming again as another burst began. The silence between each volley was heavier than the sound itself. German soldiers sat with their backs to the earth, eyes fixed on the horizon they could no longer trust. Some whispered that the light was alive, that it searched for them, remembered them. Each fifth bullet carried fire, but it was the invisible ones that haunted the imagination. The men began to see the world in those same colors, red and white against endless black. Even in safety, they looked for lines in the dark, tracing ghosts only they could see. Doctors later called it fatigue. The soldiers called it memory. To live under that light was to understand that the night would never again be quiet. Even the stars, once symbols of peace, now looked like bullets frozen in the sky. As winter crept closer, the nights grew longer, but never darker. The snow reflected the light of distant fires, and the tracers carved glowing paths through the falling flakes. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to watch. German officers no longer gave orders at night. They simply waited for morning if it came. The front lines no longer had boundaries. The war had become a single, endless horizon of light. The Browning .50 caliber had done something no weapon was meant to do. It had changed the meaning of darkness. For centuries, soldiers had prayed for night to hide them. Now they prayed for clouds thick enough to block the glow. But the winter ahead would bring no such mercy. In the forests of the Ardennes, the night would return once more, colder, heavier, and more violent than before. And in that silence, the sound of the machine would find its rhythm again. December brought silence and snow. The Ardennes forest stood white and still, a quiet world frozen beneath gray skies. But beneath that stillness, armies were moving. The Germans gathered their strength for one final strike, a desperate attempt to break through the Allied lines. They called it the last gamble. The Americans called it the bulge. When the attack began, the forest erupted. Shells fell like thunder, trees shattered, and the air turned white with smoke. But amid the chaos, one sound remained constant: the deep, steady rhythm of the Browning .50 caliber. Mounted on half-tracks and tanks, it fired through snow and wind as if weather did not exist. To the frozen soldiers, it became something strange. Not just a weapon, but a heartbeat. Each burst reminded them they were still alive, still holding the line, still waiting for dawn. The German offensive struck with fury. Tanks rolled through the snow, engines groaning beneath frozen armor. Infantry advanced through drifts waist-deep, their white camouflage blending with the landscape. For days, the Americans fell back, step by step, holding the roads with whatever they had. But one sound never faded: the .50 caliber cutting through the wind like thunder trapped inside metal. In the town of Bastogne, surrounded troops used those guns until the barrels glowed red. They fired through blizzards, through smoke, through nights so cold that even breath froze mid-air. German assaults came in waves, but every approach ended the same way, torn apart by the rhythm of American fire. The snow itself turned black from smoke and soot. Men said it looked like the forest was burning in silence. And within that silence, the Americans learned something simple: that endurance was louder than strength. The winter cold destroyed everything. Fuel lines cracked, rifles jammed, engines died. But the Browning .50 caliber kept firing. It froze over, it iced, and still it worked. Crews used bare hands to reload metal belts that burned their skin, yet none complained. Because when the snowstorm came, the gun became their only warmth, the fire that lived within steel. The Germans attacked again and again, certain the weather would favor them. For a while, it did. Planes could not fly. Supplies came late. Roads turned to glass. But on the ground, the Americans never stopped shooting. The .50 caliber ignored the cold the way the soldiers ignored fear. It cracked through the air like a drumbeat, steady and mechanical. And for those who listened carefully, it was not just survival. It was defiance. The sound of a frozen army refusing to die. For a time, the weather was the German ally. Clouds sat low over the forest. Snow fell in heavy curtains, and the sky closed like a door. American planes could not see the roads, could not find the columns, could not guide the guns. In that blind world, German armor pushed forward, engines thundering through drifts and ice. Villages vanished beneath tracks. Crossroads changed hands by the hour. The world shrank to the range of a man's breath. Yet even in that whiteness, one sound never left. From tree lines and roadblocks, from half-tracks dug into snowbanks, the Browning .50 caliber kept speaking. It carved lanes through blizzards, cut apart assaults at the moment of contact, and held exits long enough for reserves to arrive. Crews learned the feel of frozen steel through wool gloves, the weight of belts stiff with ice, the glow of barrels that steamed in the night. When the clouds finally tore open and a pale sun found the forest again, the ground was already marked by that rhythm. The weather had chosen sides for a while, but the machine had chosen forever. Morning came with a thin blue light, and the sky finally opened. You could hear it before you saw it. Distant engines rolling like drums beyond the hills. Thunderbolts returned to the roads, to the bridges, to the long black columns threading the woods. What the snow had hidden, the sun revealed. And where the planes could not reach, the ground guns finished the work. The bulge began to fold back on itself, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow unwinding powered by fuel, food, and fire. German units still fought with courage, still found gaps, still struck hard where chance allowed. But every success met a wall of replenishment. Fresh belts, fresh barrels, fresh trucks on roads that never slept. The lesson became impossible to ignore. This was not a duel of warriors or a contest of brilliant maneuvers. This was the triumph of a system. Factories joined to depots, depots joined to convoys, convoys joined to the gun that never failed. As winter loosened its grip, a harder truth took hold, that in modern war, precision bows to presence, and brilliance bends to abundance. And so we turn to the final reckoning, the lesson of industrial war. When the smoke finally cleared, the truth was visible even to those who refused to see it. The war had not been won in the trenches or the skies, but in the places far behind them, in factories that never slept, where men and women worked under harsh lights through endless nights. Every bolt they tightened, every crate they filled, was another heartbeat added to the machine that would not stop. The Browning .50 caliber was only the voice, the echo of an entire nation made of gears and schedules. German officers later admitted what they had sensed all along. They had fought an enemy that never truly tired. When their tanks burned, new ones replaced them. When their soldiers fell, convoys delivered others. Even defeat could not slow such a rhythm. The Americans had turned production into endurance, and endurance into destiny. The battlefield was simply where industry came to life. Germany had always believed in precision. Its engineers crafted weapons like instruments, beautiful, complex, exact. Each rifle, each engine, each plane carried the touch of a craftsman. But precision cannot survive scarcity. It needs time, fuel, and peace to flourish. By the end of the war, the German ideal of perfection had collapsed under the weight of numbers it could never match. The Browning .50 caliber was the opposite of that philosophy. It was not elegant. It was not fragile. It was designed to be replaced, repaired, and repeated. And in that simplicity lay its strength. The Germans brought skill, the Americans brought process, and process outlasted everything. By the final months of the war, the Luftwaffe's finest pilots, the Wehrmacht's best divisions, and the Reich's last machines all faced the same truth: that reliability had become deadlier than genius. The Browning 50 caliber outlived every empire it faced. Decades after the war ended, it still stood guard, unchanged, unbroken, unashamed. It became the proof that progress does not always come from invention. Sometimes it comes from endurance. The gun itself was simple, but the system that sustained it was extraordinary. It turned steel into willpower and noise into order. And in that transformation, modern warfare found its true face. Every German soldier who had once cursed the weapon had, in truth, faced more than a gun. They had faced an idea that, in an industrial world, quantity becomes quality. Factories became fortresses, workers became soldiers, and bullets became time itself. If you believe history still has lessons left to teach, leave your thoughts below. Because the story of the 50 caliber is not just about the past. It is about the world we continue to build, one repetition at a time. When the guns finally fell silent, the world did not cheer. It exhaled. Cities lay in ruins, forests stripped bare, skies empty, but still echoing the rhythm that had ruled them for years. Soldiers wandered through villages that no longer had names, past wrecks that had once been machines and men. The Browning 50 caliber stood quiet now, its metal cold, its purpose fulfilled. Yet its echo remained, a hum in the wind, a memory in the soil. For the Germans, defeat was more than surrender. It was the recognition that they had faced something greater than tactics, greater than courage. They had faced the logic of a new world, one built not on valor, but on volume. The sound of the 50 caliber had not just marked the end of battles, it had marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one where silence meant nothing, because even peace would forever sound mechanical. Years later, veterans would gather beneath flags and monuments, and sometimes, when the wind moved just right, they would still hear it, that deep, distant rhythm of fire, the sound of the machine that had never stopped. To them, it was not noise, it was history. Every burst remembered the factories, the hands, the endless nights that gave it life. The Browning had outlasted the empires it silenced. It had become a witness, the voice of endurance speaking across generations. In the quiet halls of museums, its metal gleams under soft light. Children walk past, unaware that the world they live in was shaped by its echo. To study the gun is to study the century, the proof that power can be built one repetition at a time. And, as the veterans fade, their words remain the same, that the real weapon of the war was not hatred, but industry. The lesson was written in steel, and its echo still lingers. And now, as history turns another page, we step into the silence that follows the sound. Long after the war ended, the echoes of the Browning 50 caliber still lingered in the air. It was not the sound itself that endured, but what it represented. A weapon forged not from hatred, but from persistence. It had no ego, no emotion, only purpose. It reminded the world that wars were no longer won by heroes alone. but by systems that could outlast everything else. On quiet mornings, veterans remembered the pulse of its rhythm, the way it shook the ground beneath their boots. They spoke softly of it, not with pride, but with awe. The gun was both savior and shadow, a tool that defended them but also defined them. Each echo carried a question. What happens when efficiency replaces valor? And somewhere between the silence and the memory, that question still waits for an answer. Time passed, and nations changed. Borders shifted, leaders fell, cities rebuilt, but the Browning remained. Through new wars, new generations, and new technologies, it stood unchanged, as if defying progress itself. 80 years after it first spoke, it still whispered across deserts, mountains, and oceans, no longer as a symbol of domination, but as proof of design done right. Historians call it efficiency. Engineers call it genius. Soldiers simply call it dependable. And yet, within that dependability lies a quiet tragedy. The idea that the perfect weapon will never grow old. The Browning .50 caliber became both monument and warning, a reminder that humanity, once it builds something that endures, will find a way to use it forever. Even peace cannot silence what was made to last. Every invention carries a piece of its creator's soul. John Browning built his machine not for glory, but for reliability. He died before it shaped the world, but his creation outlived him, a voice that still speaks in thunder and silence. Some say it represents victory, others say it represents loss, but perhaps it represents both. The truth that progress is never innocent. We live in a world still built by those factories, still powered by repetition. The lesson of the .50 caliber is not about bullets or battles. It is about humanity's hunger to endure. If stories like these remind you how history still breathes beneath modern life, subscribe for more. Because as long as we keep listening, the past will never truly fall silent. And maybe that is both the gift and the curse of remembrance. Somewhere tonight, a wind moves through a forgotten valley in France. It hums through the rusted barrels, the helmets half buried in the soil, the echoes of footsteps that will never return. The world is quiet now, but the earth remembers. It remembers the sound of the .50 caliber, the rhythm that once shook mountains and hearts alike. It remembers not the violence, but the endurance, the proof that time can't erase invention. The Browning remains not just a weapon, but a story of hands that built, of minds that designed, of a world that learned to make its heartbeat out of metal. And when night falls, and the stars glow above those same fields, it almost feels like the tracers are still there, faint lines of light stretching across eternity. Because the story of the .50 caliber was never just about war. It was about everything humanity can create, and everything it must learn to live with.